The distant whistle of the eastbound locomotive pierced the dawn's silence as Xander Morgan pulled his wagon to a halt near the train tracks. He hadn't planned to stop his destination, was still half a day's ride to Copper Creek, but something caught his eye that made his blood run cold. There, between the wooden ties of the railroad tracks, lay a small bundle wrapped in a tattered blanket. The year was 1878, and the untamed territories of Colorado had seen their share of cruelty, but nothing prepared Xander for what he discovered that crisp autumn morning. Jumping down from his wagon, his spurs jingling against the rocky ground, he approached cautiously, one hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip, a habit formed from years of vigilance in a lawless land. As he drew closer, the bundle moved. A tiny fist emerged from the blanket, followed by a soft whimper that cut through Xander like a knife. With careful hands, he gathered the bundle, discovering an infant, a baby girl with copper-colored wisps of hair and eyes the color of summer bluebells. Pinned to the threadbare blanket was a note, its message as cold as the morning air. Unwanted. "Lord Almighty," Xander whispered, his deep voice catching as he scanned the horizon for any sign of whoever had left this child to die. The train would be coming within the hour, the same train he'd been planning to avoid as he made his way to the homestead he'd purchased sight unseen. Without hesitation, Xander cradled the infant against his chest and carried her back to his wagon. "Don't you worry, little one," he murmured, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "I won't leave you here." The baby blinked up at him, her tiny face scrunching in confusion. Xander had no experience with children at 32 years old. He'd spent most of his life driving cattle, chasing gold claims, and more recently, running from memories of the war that still haunted his dreams. But something about this abandoned child stirred a protective instinct he never knew he possessed. He climbed onto the wagon's seat, arranging the infant securely in the crook of his arm. "Well now, I reckon we need to get you somewhere safe." His original plan to reach his new property before nightfall would have to wait. The nearest town, Silver Falls, was a few hours east and would have what the child needed: food, proper clothing, perhaps a woman who could care for her. As the wagon lurched forward, Xander glanced down at the baby who had, remarkably, drifted to sleep despite the jostling. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" he said quietly. "Left all alone, yet here you are, trusting a stranger like me." The journey to Silver Falls felt longer than it should have, with Xander constantly checking on his tiny passenger. By mid-morning, the baby had begun to fuss, her small cries growing more insistent. Xander had no idea how to comfort an infant, but he knew hunger when he heard it. "Just a little longer," he promised, urging his horses to a faster pace. "Town's just beyond that ridge." Silver Falls appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden buildings flanking a main street that had grown considerably since Xander had last passed through 3 years earlier. The railroad had brought prosperity to some of these western towns, though Xander had always preferred the open country to civilization. He pulled his wagon to a stop outside the general store, gathering the baby awkwardly in his arms. A few curious glances followed him as he made his way inside, the bell above the door announcing his entrance. "Mr. Morgan." The shopkeeper, Arthur Briggs, raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Didn't expect to see you back in these parts." "Wasn't planning on stopping," Xander replied, shifting the bundle in his arms. "Found myself with an unexpected situation." Arthur leaned over the counter, his eyes widening as he spotted the infant. Well, that's not something you see every day, a man like you with a baby." "Found her this morning. Someone left her on the train tracks with nothing but this." Xander showed him the note, watching as the older man's face darkened with anger. "On the tracks, good Lord." Arthur shook his head. "What kind of monster would do such a thing?" "The kind I'd like to have words with," Xander said grimly. "But right now, this little one needs milk and proper wrappings, and I need to find someone who knows what to do with a baby." "You'll want to speak with Miss Crawford," Arthur suggested, already moving to collect supplies. "She's the schoolteacher, but she's helped deliver most of the children in this town. She'll know what to do." As Arthur gathered milk, a small bottle, and soft flannel for diapers, the bell above the door chimed again. Xander turned to find himself face to face with a young woman whose appearance immediately commanded attention, not for any flashiness, but for the quiet strength evident in her posture and the intelligence shining in her green eyes. "Miss Crawford," Arthur called out. "Perfect timing. We have something of an emergency." The woman approached, her gaze immediately drawn to the bundle in Xander's arms. "What's happened?" "This is Xander Morgan," Arthur introduced them, "and he's found himself with an unexpected responsibility." Xander met her eyes directly. "Someone left this baby on the railroad tracks to die. Found her this morning with a note saying unwanted." Clara Crawford's face registered shock, followed quickly by a controlled anger that Xander found himself respecting. Without asking permission, she stepped forward and gently pulled back the blanket to examine the child. "She's dehydrated," Clara said after a moment, her voice soft but authoritative. "And cold. How long have you had her?" "Found her at dawn, about 4 hours back," Xander replied. Clara nodded, then held out her arms. "May I?" Something in Xander hesitated, a strange reluctance to hand over the baby that had been in his care such a short time. But common sense prevailed. This woman clearly knew more about infants than he did. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan," Clara said as she expertly cradled the baby. "You saved her life today." There was no artifice in her gratitude, no flattery, just a simple acknowledgement that warmed him unexpectedly. "Arthur, I'll need warm water, clean cloths, and that milk right away," Clara instructed. She glanced back at Xander. "Were you planning to take her to the sheriff?" Xander hadn't thought that far ahead. "I suppose that's the proper thing to do." "Sheriff Tanner is out of town until tomorrow," Arthur interjected as he gathered the requested items. "Riding with a posse after those bank robbers from Durango." Clara considered this information. "Then she'll need somewhere to stay tonight." She studied Xander with an assessing gaze. "Unless you're planning to take responsibility for her," the question caught him off guard. "Madam, I wouldn't know the first thing about caring for a baby. I'm on my way to a homestead I've purchased near Copper Creek, not exactly a place for a child." "I see." Clara's expression remained neutral, but Xander sensed disappointment in her tone. "Well, she can stay with me tonight. I have a room above the schoolhouse." For reasons he couldn't explain, Xander felt compelled to add, "I'm not abandoning her, just being practical about what's best." Clara's expression softened. "Of course, you've already done more than most would, Mr. Morgan." She turned to Arthur. "I'll pay for these supplies." "Not necessary," Xander interrupted, reaching for his money pouch. "I found her, I'll cover her needs." This earned him an approving nod from Clara. "Very well. Perhaps you could carry these things to the schoolhouse for me. It's just down the street." The request seemed reasonable enough, and Xander found himself following Clara out of the store, laden with packages while she carried the baby. The townsfolk they passed watched with undisguised curiosity a strange procession of the schoolteacher, a known loner cowboy, and a mysterious infant. The schoolhouse was a modest building with a small apartment attached to the back. Inside, Clara efficiently directed Xander where to place the supplies, then set about warming water and preparing milk for the baby. "Have you thought about what might happen to her?" Clara asked as she tested the temperature of the milk on her wrist. Xander leaned against the doorframe, watching as Clara's capable hands worked. "Truthfully, no, been more concerned with keeping her alive." "That's fair." Clara carefully positioned the baby in her lap and began feeding her with the small bottle. "She's very young, perhaps 3 weeks old. Someone cared for her, at least for a little while." "Before deciding she wasn't worth the trouble," Xander said bitterly. Clara looked up, studying him with those perceptive green eyes. "You sound personally offended, Mr. Morgan," he shrugged, uncomfortable with her observation. "Just never understood folks who throw away their responsibilities." "Neither have I." Clara returned her attention to the baby, who was eagerly accepting the milk. "She needs a name. We can't keep calling her the baby." "That's not for me to decide," Xander protested. "Whoever takes her in should name her." "And who might that be? Silver Falls doesn't have an orphanage." "The nearest one is in Denver, and that's a hard journey for one so young." Clara stroked the baby's cheek with gentle fingers. Besides, you found her. That gives you certain rights. Xander shifted uncomfortably. I'm not looking to claim rights to anything, Miss Crawford. I'm a man who lives alone and likes it that way. Clara, she corrected him. If we're going to figure this out together, you might as well use my given name. Together, Xander raised an eyebrow. Unless you're planning to ride away and forget about her, Clara challenged. The question hung in the air between them. Xander should say yes, that was his plan, after all. Drop the baby with the proper authorities and continue to his homestead. He had a life waiting that had no room for complications, yet something held him back from saying the words. Maybe it was the way the infant had looked at him with complete trust, or perhaps it was the quiet judgment in Clara Crawford's eyes. I'll stay until Sheriff Tanner returns, he conceded. Make sure she's properly looked after, Clara nodded, seeming satisfied with this compromise. Then I suggest we call her Cora for now. It means heart, which she'll need plenty of to overcome her unfortunate start. Cora, Xander repeated, testing the name. It fits somehow, simple but strong. That'll do. The baby Cora had finished her milk and now lay contentedly in Clara's arms, her tiny fingers curled around one of Clara's. She needs changing and a proper washing, Clara announced. If you're uncomfortable with that, you're welcome to wait outside. Xander straightened. I'll check on my horses. Need to arrange boarding for them if I'm staying in town. The livery stable is 2 buildings down from the saloon, Clara informed him. Mr. Gunderson is fair with his prices. Xander nodded and turned to leave, oddly reluctant to step away from the peaceful scene of Clara holding the baby. Mr. Morgan, Clara called after him, making him pause at the door. Thank you again for saving her. He tipped his hat slightly. Anyone would have done the same. No, Clara replied firmly. They wouldn't have. Most men would have ridden on, telling themselves it wasn't their concern. Her words followed him as he walked to the livery stable, arranging for his horses to be cared for and his wagon to be stored. The stable owner, like everyone else, was curious about the baby, but Xander provided only the basic facts. Something felt protective about Cora's story, as if sharing too much would somehow expose her to further harm. After securing lodging at the town's small hotel, Xander found himself walking back toward the schoolhouse. He told himself it was merely to check on the baby's condition, but a nagging voice in his mind suggested other motivations. There was something about Clara Crawford, her directness, her competence, the absence of the cloying femininity he'd encountered in other women that intrigued him. When he knocked on her door, Clara answered with Cora sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a dresser drawer lined with blankets. She's doing well, Clara reported before he could ask. Much more comfortable now that she's clean and properly fed. Good. Xander stood awkwardly on the threshold, suddenly unsure why he'd come. I've taken a room at the hotel. Sheriff should be back tomorrow, you said. That's the expectation. Clara hesitated, then added, would you like to come in? I've made coffee. The invitation surprised him, but he nodded and stepped inside. The small apartment was neat and organized, with bookshelves lining one wall and simple, functional furniture. It reflected its owner practical, intelligent, without unnecessary adornment. Clara poured coffee into 2 cups and motioned for him to sit at the small table. Tell me about this homestead you're heading to. Not much to tell yet, Xander replied, grateful for the neutral topic. 160 acres near Copper Creek. Previous owner couldn't make a go of it. His wife took sick and they moved back east, got it at a fair price. And what do you plan to do with it? Raise horses. This was safer ground, something he knew well. Good grazing land according to the deed, stream running through it. Needs work on the buildings, but I can handle that, Clara nodded, sipping her coffee. Ambitious for one man alone. Been on my own a long while, Xander said. Prefer it that way. Do you? Clara asked, her directness catching him off guard again. Or is it simply what you're used to? Xander frowned. Most folks don't question a man's choices so boldly, Miss Crawford. Clara, she reminded him, and I find that most people benefit from occasional questioning of their assumptions. Despite himself, Xander felt a smile tugging at his lips. You must be quite a schoolteacher. I expect the best from my students, she acknowledged, and they generally rise to meet those expectations. From the makeshift cradle came a small whimper, quickly building to a cry. Clara rose and lifted Cora with practiced ease. "She's likely hungry again," she explained, preparing another bottle. "Newborns need to eat frequently." Xander watched as Clara settled back into her chair, cradling Cora expertly while feeding her. "You seem experienced with babies." "I helped raise my younger siblings after our mother died," Clara explained. "And as the town's teacher, I'm often called upon when there's a new arrival." "No husband or children of your own?" The question slipped out before Xander could consider its propriety. If Clara was offended, she didn't show it. "No, I came west to teach 4 years ago, haven't found a man worth giving up my independence for." There was a story there, Xander sensed, but he didn't press. They sat in companionable silence as Cora finished her meal, her tiny eyelids growing heavy again. "Would you like to hold her?" Clara offered suddenly. Xander hesitated. "I'm not sure that's a good idea. I don't have much experience with babies." "All the more reason to learn," Clara countered, already standing and approaching him. "She won't break, just support her head yes like that." Before he could protest further, Xander found himself holding Cora, her slight weight settling against his chest. She blinked up at him sleepily, seemingly content in his awkward embrace. "See, natural talent," Clara said with a smile that transformed her serious face, revealing a dimple in her left cheek. Something shifted in Xander's chest, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the small body he held. He cleared his throat. "Don't know about that." Cora's tiny hand escaped her blanket, her fingers wrapping around one of his with surprising strength. The simple trust of the gesture struck him deeply. "What will happen to her?" he asked quietly, not looking up from the baby's face. Clara resumed her seat. "That depends on Sheriff Tanner. He might send inquiries to neighboring towns, see if anyone reports a missing baby. Though given how she was found." "No one's looking for her," Xander finished grimly. "Most likely not," Clara agreed. "In which case, he'll probably arrange for her to be taken to the orphanage in Denver on the next eastbound train." Xander's arms tightened instinctively around Cora. "Orphanages aren't kind places. You speak from experience," Clara asked gently. He nodded once, a sharp movement. "After my parents died of typhoid, was there for 2 years before I ran away at 12, worked ranch jobs after that." Clara's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry." "That explains your reaction to finding her abandoned." "No child deserves to be thrown away," Xander said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "No," Clara agreed quietly, "they don't." Cora had fallen asleep in his arms, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Xander found himself marveling at her, so small, so vulnerable, yet somehow surviving against all odds. "I should let you rest," he said eventually, carefully returning Cora to Clara's waiting arms. "What time does the sheriff usually return?" "Midday, if all goes well with the posse," Clara replied, settling Cora back in her makeshift cradle. "Will you come back in the morning? I need to teach my classes and someone should be with her." The request surprised him. "You trust me with her?" Clara met his gaze steadily. "You found her on those tracks, Mr. Morgan. You could have ridden past, but you didn't. That tells me enough about your character." Her faith in him was unearned but warming. "Xander," he corrected her, "and yes, I'll come at first light." "Good night then, Xander," Clara said, walking him to the door. "Good night, Clara." The familiarity of using her given name felt both strange and right on his tongue. As he walked back to the hotel through the quiet streets of Silver Falls, Xander found his thoughts unusually full of a baby's trusting grasp, of a schoolteacher's direct gaze, and of possibilities he had never before considered. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the boardwalks as Xander made his way to Clara's apartment. He'd slept poorly, his dreams filled with train whistles and abandoned children. When he knocked on her door, Clara answered immediately, already dressed for teaching in a practical blue dress, her auburn hair neatly pinned up. "Thank you for coming," she said, ushering him inside where Cora lay awake in her drawer cradle, making small cooing sounds. "I've prepared bottles for her, they just need warming. Instructions are on the table." Xander nodded, trying to appear more confident than he felt about caring for an infant alone. "We'll manage," Clara smiled, seeing through his facade. "I'm sure you will. My classroom is just through that door if you need me. Morning lessons end at noon." After Clara left, Xander stood looking down at Cora, who gazed back at him with solemn blue eyes. "Well, little one, it's just you and me for a while." Caring for Cora proved both simpler and more complicated than he'd anticipated. The feeding went well enough, but changing her was a challenge that left them both somewhat disheveled. By mid-morning, Xander had settled into a rhythm, finding himself talking to Cora as he moved around the small apartment. "Never thought I'd be playing nursemaid," he told her as he paced the floor with her nestled against his shoulder. "Had plans, you know. That homestead needs a lot of work before winter sets in. Fences to mend, roof to patch." Cora burbled in response, which Xander chose to interpret as interest. "It's good land, though. You'd like it. Creek running right through, aspen trees that'll turn gold come fall." The ease with which he included her in his vision of the homestead disturbed him, and he abruptly changed the subject, telling her instead about the horses he planned to raise. She fell asleep to the sound of his voice, and he carefully placed her in the cradle before sitting heavily in Clara's reading chair. What was he doing? In less than 24 hours, he'd become attached to this child who had literally been thrown away by her own family. It made no sense. He was a solitary man with a hard life ahead of him, carving a homestead out of untamed land. There was no place for a baby in that picture. Yet as he watched Cora sleeping peacefully, trusting in his protection, Xander couldn't help wondering if perhaps his carefully laid plans were meant to change. At noon, Clara returned from her classroom, her cheeks flushed with the exertion of managing 24 children of varying ages. "How did you fare?" she asked, immediately checking on Cora. "We came to an understanding," Xander replied, attempting humor to disguise how natural it had felt caring for the baby. "She promised not to cry too much if I promised not to drop her." Clara laughed, a musical sound that Xander found himself wanting to hear again. "A fair arrangement." She lifted Cora, who had awakened at the sound of their voices. "Did you miss me, little one?" The tenderness in Clara's expression as she held Cora stirred something in Xander, a longing he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge for many years. The image they presented Clara with a baby in her arms was so perfectly domestic that it made his chest ache with unexpected yearning. "Sheriff Tanner should be back soon," Clara said, interrupting his thoughts. "Would you like me to take her to him, or would you prefer to do it?" The question forced Xander back to reality. "I found her. It's my responsibility to see this through." Clara nodded, her expression unreadable. "I've written down everything I know about caring for her, how much she's been eating when she sleeps. It might help whoever takes her next." The clinical nature of her words struck Xander as wrong somehow. "You speak as if she's a package to be handed off. Isn't that what we're doing?" Clara challenged gently. "Passing her to the next responsible party until she reaches her final destination." Put that way, it sounded callous, though Xander knew that wasn't Clara's intent. "I suppose so. Unless," Clara began, then hesitated. "Unless what?" Xander prompted. Clara met his gaze directly. "Unless you're considering another option." The possibility hung in the air between them. Xander ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his own indecision. "I don't know what I'm considering. This isn't what I planned." "Few of life's most important decisions are planned," Clara observed. "Most come upon us unexpectedly, forcing us to reveal who we truly are." Before Xander could respond, a knock at the door announced Sheriff Tanner's arrival. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s, with a gray mustache and shrewd eyes that missed little. "Miss Crawford," he greeted Clara, then nodded to Xander. "Morgan, heard you found yourself a baby on the train tracks." "That's right," Xander confirmed, explaining the circumstances while the sheriff examined the note that had been pinned to Cora's blanket. "Nasty business," Tanner commented, his face grim. "I'll send telegrams to the surrounding towns, but chances are we won't find who did this." "What happens to her now?" Xander asked, dreading the answer he already knew. "Train to Denver leaves tomorrow morning," Tanner replied. I'll arrange for her to be taken to the St. Mary's orphanage. They do good work there, from what I hear." Xander glanced at Cora, now sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms, unaware that her fate was being decided. The thought of her being handed off to strangers, raised in an institution, no matter how well-intentioned, twisted something inside him. What if? He began, surprising himself with the words forming on his tongue. What if someone here wanted to take her? Sheriff Tanner raised his eyebrows. You offering Morgan, was he? Xander wasn't sure what had prompted the question, but now that it was asked, he couldn't retreat. I might be. Xander, Clara said softly, her use of his given name causing the sheriff to glance between them with interest. It's just a thought, Xander said quickly. Need to consider it properly. Sheriff Tanner stroked his mustache thoughtfully. Well, legally speaking, as the finder you'd have first claim if no blood kin comes forward. Would need to file the proper papers, of course. Judge Willis comes through next month. A month, Xander repeated. His homestead wouldn't wait that long. Winter preparations needed to begin immediately. As if reading his thoughts, Clara spoke up. The baby could stay with me while Mr. Morgan completes the necessary work on his property. That would give him time to prepare a proper home for her. The offer was generous, too generous from someone he barely knew. I couldn't impose on you like that. It's not an imposition, Clara insisted. I care about what happens to Cora too. The use of the name they'd given the baby seemed to confuse the sheriff. Cora, that her real name, it's what we've been calling her, Clara explained. She needed something better than the baby. Sheriff Tanner nodded, practical as always. Makes sense. Well, Morgan, you have until tomorrow morning to decide. Train leaves at 9. If you want to claim her, I'll need to know before then so I can start the paperwork. After the sheriff left, silence filled the small apartment. Xander stood by the window, staring out at the town without really seeing it, while Clara gently rocked Cora. You don't have to do this, Clara finally said. No one would think less of you for letting her go to the orphanage. I would, Xander replied simply, turning to face her. I'd think less of myself. Clara studied him, her expression thoughtful. Taking in a child isn't something to be done on impulse or out of guilt. I know that. Xander paced the small room, his thoughts tumultuous. But when I think of her on those tracks, left to die. And then I think of her being raised without anyone who truly cares for her personally. He stopped, meeting Clara's gaze. I was that child once. No one came for me. Understanding softened Clara's features. And you want to be the one who comes for her? Yes. The realization crystallized in that moment, not just a vague notion, but a certainty. Yes, I do. Your homestead isn't prepared for a baby, Clara pointed out gently. Winter's coming. It would be a hard life for both of you. I can adapt, Xander insisted. Make changes to the cabin. Find someone to help with her while I work. In Copper Creek, it's hardly more than a few buildings and a mining camp, Clara countered. Who would care for her there? The practical obstacles Clara raised were valid, but they only strengthened Xander's resolve. I'll figure it out. I've faced harder challenges. Clara fell silent, her fingers gently stroking Cora's cheek. When she spoke again, her voice was hesitant. There is another possibility. Xander waited, sensing she was choosing her words carefully. The school term ends in 2 weeks, Clara continued. I was planning to visit my sister in Denver for the winter break. I could delay that visit, help you get settled with Cora at your homestead. The offer stunned him. You do that for a man and child you barely know. For Cora, Clara corrected, though her eyes suggested there might be more to her motivation. And because I believe in what you're trying to do, it's the right thing. It would be an imposition, Xander protested. Your plans can wait, Clara finished for him. My sister would understand. And it wouldn't be forever, just long enough to help you establish a routine, make the necessary adjustments to your home. The generosity of her offer humbled him. Why would you do this? Clara looked down at Cora, a soft smile playing on her lips. Because every child deserves to be wanted. And because I think you'd be good for her. She raised her eyes to his. But I need to know you're certain that this isn't just guilt or a momentary impulse that you'll regret. Xander crossed the room to stand before Clara and Cora, looking down at the baby who had so unexpectedly entered his life. I'm certain, he said quietly. I want to give her the home I never had. Something shifted in Clara's expression, approval perhaps, or something deeper. "Then we should tell Sheriff Tanner your decision." "We," Xander repeated, caught by her use of the plural. "For now," Clara replied, a hint of color touching her cheeks. "Until Cora is settled." The implications of their arrangement, traveling together, living under the same roof while Clara helped him learn to care for Cora, suddenly struck Xander with full force. It would be unconventional, potentially scandalous in a small community like Copper Creek. "People will talk," he warned. Clara lifted her chin slightly. "People always talk. I've never much cared for their opinions when something important is at stake." Her courage impressed him. Most women he'd known were far more concerned with propriety and reputation. "It won't be easy," he cautioned. "The homestead is primitive. The previous owner left a small cabin, but it needs work." "I didn't come west expecting luxury," Clara replied with a small smile. "I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. I'm no stranger to rough living." Something warm unfurled in Xander's chest, admiration, respect, and perhaps the beginning of a deeper feeling he wasn't ready to name. "Then I accept your help, Miss Crawford." "Clara," she reminded him gently, "if we're to be temporary housemates, we should at least use each other's given names." "Clara," he agreed, the name feeling right on his tongue. Cora chose that moment to wake, her tiny face scrunching before relaxing into what almost looked like a smile. Both adults glanced down at her, then back at each other, sharing a moment of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. "I believe," Clara said softly, "that this may be the beginning of something remarkable, Xander Morgan." Looking at the woman and child before him, Xander couldn't help but agree. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Xander rode to his homestead to assess what would be needed to make it suitable for a baby, returning to Silver Falls with a list of supplies and modifications. Clara finished her teaching duties, arranging for a substitute to handle her classes until the spring term. Sheriff Tanner began the legal process that would eventually make Cora officially Xander's ward, with the possibility of formal adoption once the judge returned to the circuit. Throughout this time, Xander and Clara fell into an unexpected partnership, sharing responsibility for Cora while navigating their growing connection. Each evening, after Clara's school day ended, they would sit in her small apartment discussing plans for the homestead and Cora's care. What had begun as a practical arrangement was evolving into something neither had anticipated: a friendship built on mutual respect, and a shared purpose that sometimes felt remarkably like family. On the morning of their departure for Copper Creek, Xander loaded Clara's trunk and several crates of supplies onto his wagon while she said goodbye to her students and the townspeople who had gathered to see them off. "You're doing a good thing, Morgan," Sheriff Tanner said, approaching as Xander secured the last of their belongings. "Hope so," Xander replied, glancing over to where Clara stood with Cora bundled against the November chill. "Still not sure I know what I'm doing." "Nobody does at first," Tanner chuckled. "Been married 30 years, raised 4 children, and there were days I felt like I was making it up as I went along." The comparison to marriage wasn't lost on Xander, though he chose not to address it. "We'll manage. I'm sure you will." Tanner handed him an envelope. "Papers to show you're Cora's legal guardian, pending the judge's final approval, should anyone question your arrangement." Xander nodded his thanks, tucking the envelope into his coat. The arrangement with Clara had raised eyebrows in Silver Falls, but most people seemed to accept it as a practical solution for Cora's sake. Whether the smaller community of Copper Creek would be as understanding remained to be seen. Clara joined them, Cora securely wrapped against her chest in a sling she had fashioned. "Everything's loaded, all set," Xander confirmed. "It's about a 6-hour journey if the weather holds, should reach the homestead before sunset." They said their final goodbyes, and Xander helped Clara onto the wagon seat before climbing up beside her. As they pulled away from Silver Falls, he was acutely aware of her presence next to him, the scent of lavender that clung to her clothing, the careful way she held Cora, the determined set of her jaw as she faced the unknown ahead. Having second thoughts? He asked as the town disappeared behind them. Clara shook her head. No, you. None, Xander replied truthfully. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew with absolute certainty that saving Cora had been the right decision. The journey to Copper Creek took them through rolling hills covered with pine forests, the trail occasionally offering glimpses of distant mountains capped with early snow. They spoke intermittently, comfortable silences stretching between conversations about practical matters and occasional personal revelations. "Why did you come west?" Xander asked as they stopped to rest the horses at midday. Clara, who was changing Cora on a blanket spread in a patch of sunlight, considered the question. "Freedom, mostly. Back east, a woman's path is narrowly defined: marriage, children, a life confined to home and church. Here, there's more possibility." She smiled down at Cora. And there was a genuine need for teachers. Children in these frontier towns deserve education as much as those in Philadelphia or Boston. "And no husband waiting back east," Xander ventured, curious about her past. A shadow crossed Clara's face. "There was someone once. A banker's son who courted me for nearly a year. When he proposed, he made it clear he expected me to give up teaching once we married." She secured Cora's blanket and lifted her again. "I chose my independence." Xander nodded, understanding her choice. "Can't blame you for that. What about you?" Clara asked as they climbed back onto the wagon. "You mentioned working ranch jobs after the orphanage. How did you end up with enough money to buy a homestead?" It was Xander's turn to consider his words carefully. "Spent some years driving cattle up from Texas. Dangerous work, but it paid well. Then the war came." He didn't elaborate on his service, those memories were still too raw. "After that, I tried my hand at prospecting. Found a decent claim near Leadville, not enough to make me rich, but sufficient to buy the land and some good breeding stock." "You've lived quite a life already," Clara observed. "Suppose I have," Xander agreed, though much of it wasn't worth remembering. "Never stayed in one place long. This homestead, it's the first time I've put down roots since I was a boy." "And now you're adding a child to those roots," Clara said softly. "Life has a way of surprising us, that it does." Xander glanced at her, finding her looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "Never thought I'd be traveling to my new home with a schoolteacher and a baby. And I never thought I'd be leaving my position to help a stranger raise an abandoned child," Clara replied with a small smile. "Yet here we are." "Here we are," Xander echoed, feeling as though they were acknowledging something beyond the obvious circumstances. As the afternoon progressed, the terrain grew more rugged, the trail winding through stands of aspen and pine. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Xander pointed ahead to a small valley nestled between protective ridges. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Morgan Homestead." Clara leaned forward, taking in the view. A small cabin stood in a clearing, a stream winding past it through meadowland that would be green in spring. Behind the cabin were a barn and corral, both in need of repair but solidly built. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Isolated but beautiful." "Too isolated?" Xander asked, suddenly concerned that the reality of the homestead might overwhelm her. Clara shook her head. "No, it feels peaceful." She glanced at him. "You chose well." Relief washed through him at her approval. As they descended the final slope toward the cabin, Xander found himself seeing the property through new eyes, not just as land to be worked, but as a potential home for the unconventional family they were becoming. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, a main room with a stone fireplace, a separate bedroom, and a lean-to that had been used as a storage area. Xander had already decided this space would be converted for Clara's use, giving her privacy during her stay. "It needs work," he acknowledged as he helped Clara down from the wagon, "but the roof is sound and the chimney draws well. Previous owner left most of the furniture." Clara surveyed the interior with a practical eye. "It has potential. With some cleaning and a few feminine touches, it could be quite comfortable." While Clara settled Cora inside, Xander unloaded their supplies and tended to the horses. By the time he returned to the cabin, Clara had swept the main room and was building a fire in the fireplace, Cora asleep in a basket lined with blankets. "Found these in the storage area," Clara explained, indicating the basket. It will serve as a cradle until we can make something more suitable. The casual "we" in her statement caught Xander's attention, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he brought in the remaining supplies and helped prepare a simple evening meal from the provisions they'd brought. As darkness fell, they sat before the fire eating stew and discussing the improvements needed to make the cabin suitable for winter and for Cora's needs. The domesticity of the scene struck Xander forcefully how natural it felt to be planning and sharing a meal with Clara, how quickly they had fallen into patterns that felt like they'd existed for years rather than days. "I'll start on the lean-to tomorrow," Xander said, taking their empty bowls to the wash basin. "Make it proper for you." "There's no rush," Clara replied. "I'm comfortable enough for now." She glanced over at Cora, who was beginning to stir. Though we should discuss sleeping arrangements for tonight, the practicality of her approach helped ease the awkwardness of the situation. "You and Cora take the bedroom," Xander said immediately. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Clara nodded, accepting his solution without argument. "Once the lean-to is ready, we can move Cora into the bedroom with you. She should be near her guardian." "Her guardian," Xander repeated, the official term sounding strange, still getting used to that idea. "You're doing well with her," Clara assured him, rising to lift Cora from her makeshift cradle. "She responds to you. Babies sense when they're wanted." "She is wanted," Xander said firmly. "Whatever happens, I want her to know that." Clara's expression softened as she held Cora. "I believe she already does." That night, as Xander lay on a bedroll near the fire, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of his new home, he found himself reflecting on the strange turn his life had taken. 2 weeks ago, he had been a solitary man with simple plans: build a horse breeding operation, live quietly, answer to no one. Now he was responsible for a child and sharing his home with a woman who challenged and intrigued him in equal measure. The change should have terrified him. Instead, he found himself embracing it with a certainty that defied explanation. Somewhere between finding Cora on those tracks and watching Clara care for her with such natural grace, his carefully constructed solitude had crumbled, revealing a longing for connection he had denied for too long. The days that followed established a rhythm to their shared life. Xander focused on preparing the homestead for winter, repairing the barn, chopping firewood, sealing gaps in the cabin walls, while Clara managed the household and cared for Cora. In the evenings, they would share the care of the baby, Xander gradually growing more confident in holding, feeding, and even changing her. Clara quickly transformed the cabin's interior, using simple materials to create curtains for the windows and organizing their limited supplies with efficient practicality. The lean-to became her private room within a week, thanks to Xander's carpentry skills and Clara's determination to maintain proper boundaries between them. As November deepened toward December, the first serious snowfall arrived, blanketing the homestead in white. Xander had ridden to Copper Creek the day before, returning with additional supplies and news of the small community. "Town's curious about us," he reported as he stamped snow from his boots at the cabin door. "Storekeeper had plenty of questions about the schoolteacher and baby I brought to my homestead." Clara looked up from where she sat mending by the fire, Cora asleep nearby. "What did you tell them?" "The truth," Xander replied, hanging his coat to dry. "Found Cora abandoned, decided to take her in. You're helping until I get my bearings as her guardian." "And did they believe this practical explanation?" Clara asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Xander's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "Some did, others have their own theories, I'm sure." "People always prefer an interesting story to a simple truth," Clara observed, returning to her sewing. Xander moved to warm his hands by the fire, studying Clara's profile in the flickering light. She had adapted to homestead life with remarkable ease, her practical nature and quiet strength making her an ideal partner in their unusual circumstance. Over the past weeks, he had come to rely on her judgment and appreciate her company in ways that went beyond her help with Cora. "Got a letter for you," he said, reaching into his shirt pocket, "from your sister in Denver." Clara set aside her mending and accepted the envelope, a mixture of pleasure and something like guilt crossing her features. "Thank you. I wrote to her last week explaining my delay. Do you regret it?" Xander asked abruptly. "Postponing your visit." Clara looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "No, why would you think that?" Xander shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with his question. "It's a sacrifice, being here instead of with your family for Christmas." "It's a choice, not a sacrifice," Clara corrected gently, "and not one I regret." Her gaze shifted to Cora. "Besides, it seems I am with family of a sort." The implication of her words that they had formed something like a family unit hung in the air between them, neither willing to examine it too closely. "I should check the animals before the snow gets worse," Xander said, retreating from the moment. "Need anything from the barn while I'm out there?" Clara shook her head, already opening her sister's letter. "We're well stocked, thank you." Outside in the bitter cold, Xander took longer than necessary checking on the horses and the few chickens he'd acquired. The atmosphere in the cabin had grown charged with unspoken feelings, and he needed time to sort through his conflicted emotions. His attraction to Clara had developed gradually but undeniably over their weeks together. He admired her intelligence, her practical approach to challenges, her gentle strength with Cora. More than that, he had come to crave their evening conversations by the fire, the quiet companionship they shared as they cared for the baby who had brought them together. But Clara was temporary. She had made that clear from the beginning. Her help was a generous gift, not a permanent arrangement. Once Xander was established as Cora's guardian and had learned to manage her care, Clara would return to her teaching position in Silver Falls or perhaps move on to another opportunity. Allowing himself to develop deeper feelings for her would only lead to disappointment. When he returned to the cabin, Clara was feeding Cora by the fire, humming softly as the baby drank from her bottle. The domestic scene struck Xander with such longing that he paused in the doorway, reluctant to disturb the peaceful tableau. "You can come in," Clara said without looking up. "We don't bite." Xander entered, closing the door against the cold. "Snow's picking up, might be a proper blizzard by morning." "Good thing we're well prepared," Clara replied, adjusting Cora in her arms. "How was my sister's letter?" "Didn't read it," Xander said, confused by the question. Clara laughed softly. "I meant, would you like to know what she wrote, if you want to share it?" Xander answered, settling into the chair opposite her. "She's understanding about my delay but concerned about the propriety of our arrangement," Clara summarized. "She's offered to come here instead to provide chaperoning and additional help with the baby." Xander tensed at the prospect of another person invading their carefully balanced household. "And what did you tell her?" "I haven't replied yet," Clara admitted. "But I'm inclined to decline her offer. We're managing well enough and another person would strain our limited space." Relief washed through him. "It's your decision, of course." Clara studied him over Cora's head. "Does the idea of my sister visiting bother you?" "Not bother exactly," Xander hedged. "Just seems unnecessary." "Because you'd prefer to maintain our privacy?" Clara pressed, her perception uncomfortably accurate. Xander met her gaze directly. "Because what we have works. It's unconventional, but it works." Clara's expression softened. "Yes, it does." She returned her attention to Cora, who had finished her bottle and was blinking sleepily. "Would you like to put her down for the night? You've become quite good at it." The change of subject was welcome, and Xander accepted Cora from Clara's arms, cradling the baby with growing confidence. He carried her to the small cradle he had constructed from pine boards, placing her gently on the mattress Clara had sewn from cotton and stuffed with clean straw. "Sleep well, little one," he murmured, touching her cheek lightly. When he turned back, he found Clara watching him with an expression that made his heart skip. "What?" he asked self-consciously. "You're a natural father," she said simply. "It suits you." The compliment warmed him more than it should have. "Had a good teacher." Clara smiled, beginning to clear away Cora's feeding things. "I'm hardly an expert. Could have fooled me," Xander replied, helping with the cleanup. Their hands brushed as they worked, sending an unexpected current through him. Clara must have felt it too, for she drew back slightly, a flush coloring her cheeks. I should write to my sister before it gets too late, she said, moving toward her room. Good night, Xander. Good night, Clara, he responded, watching her retreat to the lean-to, wondering what might have happened if she had stayed. The blizzard lasted 3 days, confining them to the cabin except for Xander's necessary trips to care for the livestock. The forced proximity intensified their awareness of each other, small touches and glances taking on new significance as they moved through their daily routines. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the storm finally began to abate, they sat before the fire after Cora had been put to bed. Clara was reading one of the books she had brought with her, while Xander worked on carving a small wooden horse, a Christmas gift for Cora, though she was too young to appreciate it. Have you thought about what comes next? Clara asked suddenly, setting aside her book. Xander looked up from his carving. Next, after I leave, Clara clarified, how you'll manage Cora when you need to work the land or make trips to town. The question unsettled him, both the practical concern and the reminder that she would eventually leave. There's a widow in Copper Creek, Mrs. Abernathy, storekeeper, mentioned she sometimes helps with child care, might arrange something with her for when necessary. Clara nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. That's good. Cora will need feminine influence as she grows. The implication that he alone wouldn't be enough for Cora stung, though Xander knew Clara meant no criticism. I'll make sure she has what she needs. I know you will, Clara said softly. She hesitated, then added, I've been thinking about my position in Silver Falls. Xander's hands stilled on his carving. Oh, the school board expects me back for the spring term, Clara continued, but I'm not certain that's what I want anymore. Hope flared in Xander's chest, though he kept his expression neutral, having second thoughts about teaching. Not about teaching, Clara clarified, about where I'm teaching. She met his gaze steadily. Copper Creek has no school, the statement hung between them, its implications clear. No, Xander agreed carefully. Children ride to Summit Junction for schooling when weather permits. Many don't go at all. That's a shame, Clara said. Every child deserves education. Are you saying you'd consider starting a school in Copper Creek? Xander asked, hardly daring to believe where the conversation seemed to be heading. Clara nodded. I've been corresponding with the town council. They're interested but concerned about funding and finding a suitable building. This was news to Xander. When did you arrange this? I wrote to them shortly after we arrived, Clara admitted. I wanted to explore possibilities. Possibilities? Xander repeated, setting aside his carving, for staying in the area. Yes, Clara's gaze dropped to her hands, now clasped tightly in her lap. I find I'm reluctant to leave when the time comes. The admission sent Xander's heart racing. Because of Cora. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his with newfound boldness. Not only because of Cora, the implication was unmistakable. Xander stood, moved by an impulse he couldn't suppress, and crossed to kneel before Clara's chair. Clara, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I don't want you to leave either. She reached out, her hand touching his cheek with gentle wonder. I've tried to maintain proper boundaries between us, she confessed, to remember that our arrangement was temporary, practical. And has that worked? Xander asked, covering her hand with his own. Not at all, Clara whispered, a smile breaking across her face. I find myself quite improperly attached to both you and Cora. The admission was all Xander needed. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that began tenderly but quickly deepened with weeks of unacknowledged longing. Clara responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding into his hair as she drew him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Xander rested his forehead against hers. I never expected to find you, he murmured. Never thought I'd want someone in my life the way I want you. Nor I you, Clara replied, her voice thick with emotion. I came west seeking independence, not attachment, yet here we are. Here we are, Xander agreed, echoing their earlier conversation. He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. If you start your school in Copper Creek, would you consider staying here, with us? The magnitude of what he was asking wasn't lost on either of them. It wasn't quite a proposal, but it was a step in that direction, an acknowledgement that what had begun as a temporary arrangement had grown into something neither wanted to end. "People would talk," Clara said, echoing his earlier warning. "Let them," Xander replied, stroking her cheek. "Unless you care about such things more than I thought," Clara smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I told you before I don't much care for others' opinions when something important is at stake." She took a deep breath. "Yes, Xander, I'll stay, with you and Cora." The simplicity of her acceptance belied the significance of the moment. Xander pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if afraid she might vanish if he let go. "We'll make it official," he promised. "When the judge comes through, do things properly." Clara laughed softly against his shoulder. "Our beginning has been anything but proper. Why start now?" Her humor delighted him, and Xander found himself laughing too, a joy he had nearly forgotten bursting from somewhere deep within him. From the cradle came a small sound, Cora awakening, perhaps sensing the shift in the atmosphere of her home. Clara pulled back, her expression growing serious. "We should be clear about what this means for Cora. If I'm to stay, to be part of her life permanently, you'd be her mother," Xander finished simply. "In every way that matters." The words clearly moved Clara. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Very much." As Cora's sounds became more insistent, they moved together to the cradle, where the baby was now fully awake, her tiny hands reaching up toward them. "Hello, little one," Clara said, lifting her. "Did you hear us making plans for your future?" Xander wrapped an arm around Clara's waist, looking down at the child who had brought them together. "I think she approves," he said as Cora made a contented gurgling sound. "Of course she does," Clara replied, leaning into his embrace. "She knows she's wanted now." The word struck Xander forcefully, the opposite of the cruel note that had been pinned to Cora's blanket when he found her. "Wanted," he repeated, "by both of us." As the blizzard's fury diminished outside, the small family stood together in the warmth of the cabin, bound by choice rather than blood, by love rather than obligation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, the cowboy who had stopped by a lonely stretch of track, the baby who had been abandoned there, and the schoolteacher who had helped them become a family. The weeks that followed brought changes to the homestead, as Xander and Clara adjusted to their new understanding. Though they maintained separate sleeping quarters out of propriety, Xander insisting they do things properly, until they could be married, their daily interactions took on a new intimacy, filled with stolen kisses and meaningful glances that spoke of a shared future. Christmas arrived with a fresh snowfall that transformed the homestead into a winter wonderland. Though their celebration was simple by Eastern standards, it felt rich with promise to Xander as he watched Clara hang small decorations she had crafted from pine cones and ribbons. "Never had much use for Christmas before," he admitted as they sat by the fire on Christmas Eve, Cora sleeping peacefully in her cradle. "Orphanage tried to make it special, but it always felt hollow." Clara's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. "And now?" Xander squeezed her hand gently. "Now it feels like it should, like family." The next morning, they exchanged modest gifts, a hand-knit scarf from Clara to Xander, a journal bound in soft leather from him to her, and for Cora, the carved wooden horse Xander had completed and a small rag doll Clara had sewn in secret moments. "She's too young to appreciate them," Clara acknowledged as they placed the toys near Cora, who was more interested in the colorful wrapping paper. "But someday we'll tell her about her first Christmas with us." "The first of many," Xander said, the promise in his words making Clara's eyes shine. As January brought even colder temperatures, life at the homestead settled into a comfortable routine. Xander continued his work preparing for spring planting and caring for the livestock, while Clara began organizing her plans for the Copper Creek School, corresponding regularly with town officials and potential students' families. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, moving beyond the initial attraction to a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They learned each other's habits and histories, filling evening hours with stories of their pasts and dreams for their future together. It was during one such evening, as February's winds howled outside the snug cabin, that Xander finally asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Clara," he began, taking her hands in his as they sat before the fire. "I know we've spoken of marriage as something to happen eventually when the judge comes through." He paused, gathering his courage. "But I'd like to make it official between us now. Will you marry me?" Though the proposal was expected, tears sprang to Clara's eyes at the formal question. "Yes, Xander, with all my heart, yes." The circuit judge wouldn't return until April, but they decided not to wait for a formal ceremony. The following Sunday, they drove the wagon to Copper Creek, where the traveling preacher who visited monthly performed a simple service in the back room of the general store, with Cora in Clara's arms and a handful of curious townspeople as witnesses. "Not exactly the wedding most girls dream of," Xander apologized as they drove home through the winter landscape. Clara, now officially Mrs. Morgan, laughed. "Most girls didn't dream of finding a husband and daughter in one unexpected package either. Yet here I am, happier than I ever imagined possible." That night, as Cora slept soundly in the main room, Xander and Clara retired to the bedroom together for the first time as husband and wife. Their lovemaking was both tender and passionate, the culmination of months of growing feelings and the beginning of a lifetime together. "I never thought I'd find this," Xander confessed as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, the winter cold kept at bay by their shared warmth. "A woman who could love me despite knowing all my rough edges. Because of them, not despite them," Clara corrected, her head resting on his chest. "Your edges match mine, it seems." Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers across the meadow and new possibilities for the homestead. The judge's visit in April made Xander's guardianship of Cora official, with adoption proceedings to follow. Clara's school plans progressed, with the town council offering the use of an abandoned store building that could be converted into a classroom. "It will be small to start," she explained as they worked together planting the vegetable garden. "Perhaps a dozen children of various ages, but it's a beginning." "You'll be a wonderful teacher," Xander assured her, pausing in his digging to watch as she showed Cora, now nearly 6 months old, a butterfly that had landed on a nearby flower. "Look at how you are with her." Clara smiled, the spring sunshine highlighting the auburn in her hair. "She makes it easy. She's so curious about everything." "Like her mother," Xander observed, the words still new but feeling increasingly natural. The summer brought the opening of Clara's school, which proved immediately popular with families tired of sending their children on long rides to Summit Junction. Though it meant Clara was away from the homestead for part of each day, they adjusted their routines accordingly, with Xander managing Cora during school hours and focusing on his outdoor work when Clara returned. By autumn, exactly 1 year after Xander had found Cora on the train tracks, their unconventional family had become an accepted part of the Copper Creek community. The homestead had flourished under their combined efforts, the garden producing abundantly, the first foals from Xander's breeding program showing promise, and improvements to the cabin making it truly a home. On the anniversary of Cora's arrival in their lives, they took her to the spot where the wagon trail crossed the train tracks, now a place of beginning rather than abandonment. "Should we tell her someday?" Clara asked as they stood together, Cora balanced on Xander's hip, her copper hair catching the autumn sunlight. "About how she came to us," Xander considered the question carefully. "Yes," he decided, "when she's old enough to understand. Not to hurt her, but so she knows how much she was wanted, even when it seemed she wasn't." Clara nodded, leaning against his side. "That she was chosen, not just born to us. That finding her was the best thing that ever happened to me," Xander added, kissing Cora's forehead. "Because it led me to both of you." As they returned to their wagon, leaving behind the tracks that had once held such tragedy, Xander marveled at how completely his life had transformed in a single year. The solitude he had once craved had been replaced by the joyful chaos of family life. The independence he had guarded so fiercely now willingly shared with the woman who had become his partner in all things. The note that had been pinned to Cora's blanket, that cruel, dismissive, unwanted, had been kept, tucked away in the family Bible as a reminder of how differently things might have turned out. But its message had been thoroughly disproven by the love that now surrounded the child who had been abandoned. Later that evening, as they sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Clara rested her head on Xander's shoulder, Cora sleeping peacefully in her lap. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't decided to stop that morning," she mused. "If you had ridden past or taken a different trail." "I can't imagine it," Xander replied honestly. "Can't imagine my life without either of you in it anymore." "Nor can I," Clara agreed. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. "Do you believe in fate, Xander, that some things are meant to be?" Xander had never been a man given to philosophical ponderings, but the past year had changed him in countless ways. "I believe Cora was meant to be found," he said slowly. "And that you were meant to be her mother. Our paths crossing wasn't accident, it was providence." Clara smiled, the expression lighting her entire face. For someone who claims not to have a way with words, that was beautifully said. "Must be your influence," Xander replied, bending to kiss her softly. "You're making me respectable, schoolteacher." "Not too respectable, I hope," Clara teased, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Xander laughed, the sound carrying across the homestead that had become so much more than land and buildings. It had become the foundation for their family, rooted in a love that had begun with an abandoned child and a cowboy who couldn't ride past. As darkness settled over their mountain valley, they carried Cora inside, putting her to bed with gentle words and tender touches. In the quiet that followed, as they prepared for their own rest, Xander caught Clara in his arms, overcome with gratitude for all that had come from that fateful morning. "I love you," he said simply, the words still new enough to feel special each time they were spoken. "And I love you," Clara replied, her arms encircling his waist. "Both of you with all my heart." Outside, the distant whistle of a passing train echoed through the valley, no longer a sound of abandonment, but a reminder of the journey that had brought them together and the life they continued to build, one day at a time, in a home where everyone was truly wanted.